Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. You're listening to a show that is all about ideas, about the search for wisdom and knowledge through conversation. My guests all have something to say and have the credentials to say it persuasively. Here, the conversation continues. Thank you for joining me for Season 7 of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I want to thank the Acton Institute for sponsoring today's episode. I've had the privilege to go to Acton University 4 times, and each occasion has been a wonderful encouragement. Definitely check them out at acton.org. The Acton Institute has gotten into podcasting, and today I want to tell you all about Acton Line, their premier interview show. Acton Line is a weekly interview podcast from the Acton Institute featuring a wide variety of guests whose work and expertise help to move us toward a free and virtuous society. From theology and philosophy to economics and law, church and state to business and culture, Acton Line brings the Acton Institute's unique synthesis of piety and technique to every sphere of life. We're engaging and illuminating conversations that connect good intentions with sound economics. Subscribe to Acton Line on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to find podcasts. I'm your host, Josh Hannon. Today, my guest is Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. Catherine Pakaluk joined the faculty at the Bush School at Catholic University of America in the summer of 2016. She is an associate professor of social research and economic thought. Formerly, she was the assistant professor and chair of the economics department at Ave Maria University. Her primary areas of research include economics of education and religion, family studies and demography, Catholic social thought, and political economy. Dr. Pakaluk is the 2015 recipient of the Acton Institute's Novak Award, a prize given for, quote, significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty, and a 2023 Freedom and Opportunity Prize winner from the Heritage Foundation. Pakaluk did her doctoral work at Harvard University under Caroline Hawksby, David Cutler, and 2016 Nobel laureate Oliver Hart. Beyond her formal training in economics, Dr. Pakaluk studied Catholic social thought under the mentorship of Russell Hittinger and Thomistic thought with Stephen A. Long. She is a widely admired writer and sought-after speaker on matters of culture, gender, social science, the vocation of women, and the work of Edith Stein. She lives in Maryland with her husband, Michael Pakaluk, and 6 of their children. She's also the author of the groundbreaking 2024 book that we'll be discussing today, Hannah's Children, the Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. Catherine, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thank you so much. It's super great to be here. And I almost want to ask you how you did your background, but I don't know if I'm going to. It's pretty great. It's just great.
Well, I'll be sure to pass that on. That I don't know exactly how this happened. I'm recording at Bailey's College where I teach, and
okay.
This is our big collegiate. Yep, it's our big collegiate meeting room. Super. We came in one day, and the founder had decided that we needed wallpaper, and so I assume that Mr. Luddy approved the wallpaper, but behind me is
that Budapest?
That is Budapest. You are officially the first guest to get it right on first guess.
Yeah, it looks like Budapest to me. That's great. Now, I have to say I haven't been to Budapest, but I've looked at a lot of photos. I have been to a lot of the lookalike cities like Prague, so I know it's not Prague. But my compliments to the stage. It's lovely and seems very fitting for Thales College.
I think so. It certainly makes it just definitely elevates the room quite a bit.
It's great.
Well, Dr. Pakaluk, I've been thinking about your book a lot over the last month, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. But before we get there, tell us a little about your journey, your academic work, and your family life. Both come up quite a bit in the book. So I think to really understand your book, we need to know you. So help us know some of your story.
Sure. Thanks for that question. So it's where should I start? Well, you read my bio, so of course, but that's true. People might have been phased out a little bit when bios are like that. So what would I want to start with? I think it would be something like, maybe I'll start here. I was raised in a big Catholic family, and I knew when I was in high school that I was interested in questions related to people, which sounds really funny. It sounds really basic, but why? Well, so I thought that when my mom had a baby, it was like kind of the best thing ever. And I thought that the best job you could have would be to help deliver babies, which sounds funny, but it's just true. So I figured, like, if you want to deliver babies, you should like go into medicine. So I started as a teenager. I started looking into opportunities to study medicine. I was always kind of a researchy type, and I didn't realize that might mean that maybe I was meant to research and not actually deliver babies. It didn't occur to me at the time. And so I ended up doing some sort of internship research at the National Institutes of Health, and this is the 1990s, early to mid 1990s, and I was working in the viral epidemiology branch of the National Cancer Institute. So I was working with researchers who studied the kinds of cancers you get when you have viruses, particularly human retroviruses, and in that time we were looking at AIDS. And basically, the short part of the story is that I heard people who were very bright, very talented, and very elite by a lot of standards talk, kind of under their breaths, and maybe not always under their breaths, over the lunch table about how good it was that AIDS was going to wipe out a lot of the population in Africa. And, as a idealistic young kid who thought like babies are the best thing ever, this is why I was there. This totally radicalized me. I thought, what the heck? Could this be true? Could it be the case that we have to sort of sit around and hope for viruses and diseases in order to clear out the world of a lot of unwanted people, or people that are threatening prosperity because there's too many of them? So I didn't know the answer to that. It seemed wrong. It seemed, like totally crazy. But I thought, I don't really know what leads to prosperity. I don't know why or where there's enough for people to eat. Don't know anything about those things. So I thought, well, how do I learn more about that? And that is what economics is about. And as a early college student, I never really heard about it. I mean, I just didn't know what economics was. So I started to look into it. Anyway, that's kind of how I got launched into economics as a discipline. And I suppose the rest of the story is that after college, I applied to grad school. I enrolled at Harvard in the PhD program, and that was all great, and I thought my life was figured out. I was going to go to grad school and, figure out the meaning of the universe and solve world poverty, obviously. And then I met my husband at the end of the first year of graduate school and realized quickly that we were called to get married. So we got married and started having a bunch of kids. And so that's sort of the background. That's probably enough that to help your readers figure out who I am. So I ended up having 6 kids when I was in graduate school, which was not a normal thing to do, and continued working on the types of puzzles I was interested in. And so I suppose if you had asked me at the time when I finished graduate school, would I be doing my first book on this topic, I never would have said yes. But obviously, this book covers, a whole wide range of things related to what I just mentioned. So yeah, you're not wrong. This book is a pretty fair reflection of the kinds of things that I've become as a person. We ended up having a couple more kids, so we've got 8 kids altogether.
That's amazing. And I want to go back to that, just one quick follow-up on that story.
Sure.
When you're sitting there at the National Institute of Health, and kind of this is the discussion around I presume, I'm imagining sort of a break room, and this is a speculation. Is the impetus, or is the sense of that, is this sort of a race thing, and we want to get rid of this other race, or is this sort of a Malthusian, the world's overpopulated, Africa's very populated, so we should depopulate Africa?
Yeah.
Like, what's the rationale behind that line of thinking?
Yeah. So I didn't pick up any racial elements to that when I was there. My memory, in fact, one of the doctors I really looked up to was an African American woman who I thought was really spectacular, just a great researcher. I didn't pick up a race thing. I just sort of picked up this idea that, like, there's just too many people. And so, if now and then, diseases like kind of like wipe out like whole swaths of the population, that wouldn't really be so bad, would it? And of course, it's always like people looking at other continents where, it might not be so bad if lots of people are wiped out. So, I mean, there's certainly that piece. But yeah, I didn't pick up a racial thing. I didn't probe,
Okay.
I was just a kid. And,
Sure.
but I just remember scratching my head. I thought, like, this is bad, right? It's bad if people get sick and die, and they die these horrible deaths. Like, that should be an unqualified bad. But here were these like elite people, and obviously part of it was like, led me to these questions, well, what are the conditions for prosperity, right? How do we know we'll have enough? But another piece of it, which I've mentioned recently, is that it kind of really set me up it was a kind of red pill moment of sorts where you realize, okay, these are some of the smartest people around. These are people with MDs and PhDs, and they work at the nation's premier government-sponsored body of biomedical research. And they hold opinions that I think are pretty dour, if not downright bad, right? So it kind of it immunized me a little bit against the idea that sort of like if you have a lot of letters after your name, or if you're super smart, or if you get big dollar amount of government funding for your research, that necessarily means that you're a wise person or a good person. So I think it was good to see that from a young age. Yeah.
Oh, sure. I've got a good friend of mine, Will Begley. He came on the show a couple seasons back, and we did a Shakespeare conversation together. He has a PhD in classics from UNC Chapel Hill, but he was the first person I knew who had a PhD who actively went around telling people no one needs to get a PhD. The PhD is no guarantee that you are either intelligent or wise. And if you are intelligent and wise, you might get one, and hopefully you still be intelligent or wise, but it doesn't lead. The wisdom doesn't lead to the degree, and that I keep meeting people who share that view. That's helpful to keep
100%. Yeah, I mean, I went to grad school to learn the answer to certain questions. I had no thought of whether it was connected to a career or what I would do later. It was purely just, I've got questions I can't answer. That was kind of all that was back there. Yeah.
Which might be the best reason to go to grad school. I mean, if it makes sense on a personal financial level and you've got the curiosity itch.
Right.
Yeah, I'm tempted to follow that tangent, but I want to stick with our planned route of questions. I think there's I remember growing up in the 90s, and there were so many, there was just this vibe of I remember so many biology classes in middle school and high school where the great danger was going to be overpopulation, so we really needed to cut down on population. And we really seem to be in the opposite position today. So I wonder if we could, let's go to the birth dearth idea for a second.
Yeah.
I know that's been a very popular term. It seems I've seen it more in the last couple of months, but it's been around for years. I suspect some of my listeners maybe haven't been following that as much. Could you update us on the idea of the birth dearth and kind of where are we in terms of global and national population decline, and what does that have to do with our economic future?
Right. Okay. Great. So I agree with you that a lot of people haven't probably heard the term. I figured everybody knew the term birth dearth, and when I shared it with actually some of my older children who are in their 20s, they said, "Oh, well, what the heck is this birth dearth? It's very cute. It's cutesy." And I said, "No, I didn't coin that term. That term was coined by Ben Wattenberg in the 1980s." Well, it was the title of a book. I think he may have actually coined it as a phrase referring to the lack of births in the 1970s in one of his earlier works. And it just refers to the idea that one of the popular metrics we use to measure how many births there are, which will tell us how many people there will be in the future, is the total fertility rate. And this is an expected number. It's a number we compute from present rates of births. And it's a number that tells us how many births we think a woman will have in her childbearing lifetime. And it was Ben Wattenberg who said, don't pay attention to the total overall number of people being born. Take a look at how many people we expect a woman, a currently born woman, to have in her lifetime. So the total fertility rate, sometimes we say TFR. So Ben Wattenberg said in the 1970s, in the midst of the full-on population bomb rhetoric, he said, we don't have a population bomb, we have a dearth of births to worry about. And then he published a couple of books on this in the 1980s, and in his last couple of books in the early 2000s before he passed away. He's kind of a prophet of the birth dearth, we'll say. But you asked me, where are we? So basically throughout the 1980s and then the 1990s, United States birth rates looked like they were generally above this magic number. This is like a 2.05 number. How many births will a woman have in her lifetime? If a country is at 2.05 or more, the 0.05 is just for mortality. We basically say the population doesn't grow and it doesn't shrink. It's the replacement number. And throughout the 80s and the 90s, while countries like Japan, Korea were shrinking down to birth rates well below replacement, as were Western Europe, countries like Spain and Italy, the United States was still kind of comfortably at or above that number, the 2. But we know now that that comfortably above was really mostly due to immigration. If we looked at native-born women in the United States, born in the United States, we would have seen that those numbers were already trending below replacement in the 80s and the 90s. So today, for the United States, the most recent numbers from the CDC say that we are at about 1.64 births per woman expected in her lifetime. That's the lowest number we've ever seen in the United States. It's pretty low. And so if you keep up numbers like that, and we have for many decades, but we're trending lower and lower, pretty soon you'll start to see a shrinking population. Now, for the world as a whole, we would have said 10 years ago, well, of course, the world as a whole is not close to shrinking. The world as a whole has lots and lots of countries with lots and lots of people in them in which the birth rates are above replacement. But actually, in the last couple of years, that's started to look more doubtful. The iron truth about birth rates is that they have converged to that low, low level very rapidly, much more rapidly than anyone expected. So what that means is if people in countries with low populations are thinking, maybe we'll have immigration in the future to correct for these low birth rates, they're wrong. There will not be immigration to correct for the low birth rates. You really have to look hard around the world to find places where there are still birth rates above 3 or 4. A country like Mexico has below replacement fertility, and most people, I think, here would guess that was still not true. That Mexico is well above replacement. Mexico in the mid 1970s, around the time I was born, they had as many as many births per woman as the United States did in 1800. So think about that for a minute. In less than 50 years, Mexico has made a demographic transition that it took the United States 200 years to make. And that gives you really a clear sense of the speed or of what we call convergence. So other countries aren't making the same transition in 200 years like us. They're making it in rapidly, in 30 to 40 or 50 years. And so that is where we are as a globe now. We think that within the next decade or sooner, depending on where these things go, the whole global population expected birth rates will be below replacement. So that's the general overall picture. And just in a word, it portends, or it seems to imply that we will see in the countries with very low birth rates shrinking or contracting economics. So we will have lower levels of prosperity, fewer businesses, goods and services, because we just won't have the labor to staff these things.
Walk us through just a little bit of the what that means. I think I'm also a debate coach in another life, and so I think of that in terms of impact calculus. And,
yep.
I think we've spent a decent amount of time in debate circles thinking about the United States as a very heavy welfare state country, and the welfare state economics is all based on a larger working population than retiring population. But from what you're saying, it sounds like we cannot assume that will be the case 20 years from now. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So actually, it's not 20 years from now. It's now. So we're already. Yeah, I know. So hate to bring it to. So in terms of impact or rhetorical impact, this is now. So we are already looking at a shrinking working age population. Right. Why? Because we have a larger, in terms of the, we call it the pyramid of the ages of people, the age structure of our population. We all know this. We have this large retiring number of boomers, and now the younger boomers are starting to retire. So there's a lot of them. And so they're exiting the workforce, and there's not so many of the current younger, the younger population that's entering the workforce. So we have got more people exiting the workforce than people entering the workforce, which means our working population is already shrinking. Right. So yeah, it's happening now. But you also said, it looks like these sort of the welfare state or government programs depend upon, yeah, well, for sure, they depend upon a growth in the working age population. Uh, at least they depend upon it not shrinking, right? So we could do those calculations, but they do use birth rate numbers when they make their computations about whether these programs can be funded into the future. So we know that Social Security just has a couple of years. I mean, we already know that, of course, these are pay-as-you-go systems, right? There's not like a big pot of money out there kind of gaining interest. So yeah, yeah. So I put it this morning to a reporter, like, that the balance sheet or the budget of the federal programs will have to go on a diet, right? Like, it'll have to shrink down regardless of who wins the political argument, right? We could have these arguments back and forth. Should we grow the social programs? I mean, for today, for instance, a lot of really interesting debates about, well, should we spend more on families? Should we spend more to incentivize people to have children? It doesn't really matter whether that argument wins the day politically, or any other question. Should we spend more on Ukraine? Should we spend more on whatever it might be? We will be basically facing pretty quickly a much smaller budget to do anything interesting with. So yeah, that's coming. That's coming right away.
Well, it's that bad news is never fun to hear, but it's really helpful to hear it in clear ways.
Yeah.
And last thing before we get to your book, I want to spend just a second on your method in this book, because
Sure.
I've spent 11 years working for Bob Luddy, and he loves Austrian economics, and so that means about once or twice a year I'll be in the presence of a real economist, not a high school economics teacher, but like somebody who has usually a PhD in economics. And on balance, I find that economists are very difficult people to talk with, because they get so immersed in the numbers and these what seem to me to be very abstract calculations, that they sort of lose the ability to actually talk to real people. So I was a little nervous when I picked up your book. I thought, oh no, an economist, okay, what's this going to be like? But then you didn't follow that method. You followed a qualitative method. And you really, but I thought as far as I could tell, like your findings are all valid. Like it was a very well done study. So could you walk us through just a little bit of your thought process? Why go a qualitative analytic approach instead of a quantitative, more econometric tables and graphs and that sort of thing? Why this method?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I'm always delighted if somebody kind of notices that that's an important piece of this. So why? Well, a couple of things. What is the value of qualitative work at all? And so just to for the the listeners who haven't picked up my book, when you say it's qualitative, what that means is that I talked to a bunch of people. Like they go, oh, novel, right? I talked to a bunch of people. Instead of coming up with kind of summary statistics of groups of people and then kind of averaging those out. So it's really important to understand the differences in the reasons why you might choose a qualitative or a quantitative approach. The reason I chose a qualitative approach is because we already know what the statistics tell us about kind of the direction of birth rates, right? And so what I just described, the direction of birth rates, is a description. So we use quantitative work. We try to put facts or observations about people into numbers, and we can average them, and we can draw correlations between averages, or in other moments of the distribution. We do all of that basically for two reasons. And one is to get a good handle on what we're looking at. So we would say we want a representative sample to describe something. So, okay, that's pretty valid and important to describing a population really well. Now, that's important, as long as the thing we're describing can be summed up in a number. All right, we'll save that for a minute. But the other reason why quantitative work, the other reason we do quantitative work, and the reason that I think most economists typically engage in it today, is because it's the kind of thing that can help us draw, we'll say, meaningful conclusions about likely treatment effects. Okay, so when I say treatment effects, that's all of policy. So everything that a policymaker wants to do, they say, well, what if we cut back on taxes? What if we increase taxes? What if we do this benefit? What if we adjust the subsidy in this way? These are all just different ways of asking a question about a treatment effect. And to do that, you have to take data that you might have from existing populations in a quantitative way, and then sort of simulate the effect of a treatment or learn from the effect of a previous treatment. And we could think about all kinds of ways that social scientists do that. We like to say we don't typically run experiments, but we do. We look at cases where people were, we'll say, as if they were treated by a policy. We just look at what happened, what was the change. And so, for instance, in this subject, we might say, well, what happens when you, uh, through policy, send people a baby bonus for each baby? Do we see birth rates increasing, right? So that's when you want to do quantitative work. That's what the purpose of that is. What would you do qualitative work for? When would you stop and talk to people? Well, the reason you'd stop and talk to people is if you kind of already knew what the behavior of the big variables was, but you didn't really know why. Right. And why is a kind of theory about human nature. You need to understand like what's taking place with people. Why are they not responding? We thought they would respond. We think people respond to incentives, right? So they're not responding. Why aren't they responding? So the qualitative approach is the thing that you should choose when the question in front of you is essentially a question about human nature. And so now you asked about economists. So economists today, of course, mostly engage in this kind of policy treatment analysis, this quantitative stuff. But economists in the past, and for instance, a lot of the Austrian economists that you might have read or that you mentioned earlier, have tended to focus more on these questions of human nature. What are people like? What are the ways that they respond to costs and benefits? What's the nature of a cost? Like, how do people internalize costs? And there's a lot more things there. So certainly my method shares an intuition about economics with a lot of the Austrians, as it's clear in the book. But the main thing is that we know a lot about birth rates. We know a lot about what hasn't worked to reverse the birth rates. And so I thought, well, what I could contribute here is maybe a story about why, like what's going on, and maybe shed some light on the problem of low birth rates by studying higher ones.
I think it's really helpful in part because you're looking at something that is so personal for so many couples. And for so many families, they're thinking through what do they want their families to look like, and you got
Right.
and all those things. So treating this really as a human question with human actors
Yeah.
and human actions that really befits a much more humane kind of study. I found to be very valuable.
Good. Yeah.
I do also just want to, without going into any further detail, I just want to thank you for the hat tip you put in the beginning to couples that wanted kids but were not able to get there. I thought that was just there's an increasing, that's a whole other segment of the population that I think will be of increasing concern hopefully in coming years, because there's a lot of folks in that boat. So I appreciated you recognizing that.
Yeah, since you mentioned it, I'll go ahead and say it for any of your listeners, that the reason to study people with large families is research focus, and I explain all those reasons, but it's certainly not to make anybody feel bad or less because they weren't blessed or their life circumstances didn't allow them, or whatever. I try to say that every time I talk about the book because my closest friend is in that category, and I would be very sorry if my work led to anybody feeling bad.
Well, with that, let's get into it. We've done a lot of preparatory things. I felt like I got to know the ladies that you got to know by the time I finished reading your book. So let's start there. Tell us about some of the women that you interviewed. They all seem to come from a variety of backgrounds. There was this. I didn't meet anybody that I thought, wow, what an unintelligent human being. They all seem to be very flourishing, smart women who some intended to go this route of the big family mom, others kind of fell into it. So tell us a bit about these ladies.
Sure. Well, my goal in picking the sample, of course, I talked to 55 women altogether around the country. How did I pick the ones that I feature in the book? You might say, well, maybe you picked them because they've got such interesting stories. Like, some of them have really dramatic stories, right? Actually, that's not how I picked them. I picked them to try to give you, the reader, a sense of all the different ways people could end up this way, right? So, like, at least in my sample, what are the different ways? And some people, as you said, they always knew they wanted kids. They always knew they wanted a lot of kids, or that they would be open to that. Other people totally stumbled into it. And so, as a reader, you want to see that. You want to see what are the different ways it happens. But yeah, we had a whole range of women who had, done just kind of simple college degrees, and women who'd done um, uh, like master's degrees and then advanced degrees, doctors and lawyers. Again, no judgment there in terms of the selection. I was just looking for the whole set of kinds of things. I did choose college educated women, again, not to cast any aspersions on people who don't have college degrees, but mainly because I wanted to ask people questions about their marriage quality and their family circumstances. And of course, if you have a college degree, we know that you're less likely to suffer some of the financial hardships. It just made my sample cleaner, right? So not to cast aspersions. Okay, so we had like religious conversions. Some of those are really great. The story that I lead off with in the book is a woman who grew up in a secular Jewish household, and she was kind of going through that existential crisis after college, like what's the meaning of life and where am I going to find all the answers to everything. And at some point, she's on the beach meditating in Hawaii and trying to own nothing. And then on her quest to find out what the meaning of everything is, she eventually goes to Israel. She was raised Jewish, but really secular, goes to Israel, meets a charismatic rabbi, meets her husband in the same community. He's also from the United States. They come back to the States completely converted. They want to live this very intentional Jewish life, which is not how they were raised. And they get married to start a large family, hopefully to start a large family. So that's a great story. And you get to know her a little bit. But then you meet like the Mormon woman on the West Coast who, like was from a big family, and always knew she wanted a big family. And she thought, well, this is where the joy in life is. And so she kind of got married, and she didn't even know how unusual she was. She thought this was totally normal. So a real spectrum. You meet the doctor who finished medical school residency, met her husband in medical school, certainly never saw herself having a large family, then stopped practicing medicine for a few months to have her first baby. And then when she stopped practicing medicine, realized, you know what, I don't like practicing medicine, and I really like being with my baby. It's a really dramatic story. She explains it piece by piece. Then she said that she was the first time taking time off to have her baby. It was the first time in all of her years of schooling and work that she'd ever, I think as she puts it, come up for air and realized she didn't like what she was doing. And so she said she stayed home, and she said, and then I stayed home and I really enjoyed my baby. And then we had another one. I really enjoyed my second baby. And she said, and then there was this slow process where we kind of tipped over into being the kind of people who, we looked around and said, gosh, there's a lot of them. And that's a great story. And then in the chapter after her, you meet the woman in Utah who really feels deeply called to be a physician, went to medical school, did her residency in pediatrics, and is still today practicing pediatrician. And her husband decided to stay home to make it easier for her to do that. And so, so two very different stories. Somebody who just walked away from medicine and became, as she puts it, a surprise stay-at-home mom. And the woman who actually, she works 2 days a week. She supports her family on 2 days a week. And the dad mostly stays home, and they have this beautiful family. So really different experiences.
I think the religious variety surprised me, because I kind of expected, but I know plenty of folks who have big families and different religious views, but I expected the sort of stereotypical big Catholic family, and there were a few of those. But then you also had one story. It sounded like you and your research partner. I just remember you were describing like going to a small church in the middle of the mountains somewhere, and like there was something about Google Maps. Wasn't sure if you were still on the road.
That's right. That's totally right. We had to turn around and go back because we lost our signal. It's this kind of rural. Well, yeah, actually in Colorado, it turns out you can be not very far off the main road and already lose your maps. And I didn't know that. So I had to turn around and download the map and then try again. Right. Yeah. And they just, that couple, they're the first full chapter. Like you said, like just traumatic religious, variation. And we could talk if you want to about kind of the differences among the churches. We might think, like you said, like you think Catholic or Mormon. I mean, it's almost like a thing. People say, are you Catholic or Mormon? You got all those kids. But we found like evangelical Protestants, this couple would have identified as being, certainly Bible believing, but probably evangelical. They had their own church. They had their own church, and he was the pastor of their church. And they felt that they received a kind of personal calling to have as many children as the Lord would send them. And they stressed they didn't feel that it was a calling for everybody, but it was a calling for them. And they absolutely loved the huge family they had built. I think she had 12 children. And I'm still in touch with them, and they're just a delightful family. They were happy to be identified in the book, so they're the only family that is not a pseudonym in the book. Yeah, they're like a real name, and you know exactly where they live. Everybody else has got to be very vague, because to respect people's privacy. But yeah, absolutely. And so they were evangelical, but of course I met mainline Protestants as well.
Did you meet? I was a little surprised. I don't remember any Muslim families. Did you end up with any Muslim folks in your sample?
No, I didn't, and I think there's a footnote to the effect that we looked for them, but in the period of time when we were kind of picking the sample, we weren't able to connect with any. And I'll just say, if I knew as many people would read the book as have, I would have worked harder to find to get those women into the sample. And so I didn't, but I certainly in a subsequent round of work, I could expand to include some Muslim women. I don't know if I have a hypothesis on whether it would be similar, but yeah. But we looked for them. We also looked for atheists and non-religious women. We did look very hard. We have one woman in the book who's certainly less religious. She identifies as being having a Jewish household, but she says very specifically that they're having children as distinct from being Jewish. So she separates those two things. Yeah.
I've got a lesson I'm prepping for a couple weeks from now. We're talking about like the difficulty of studying history and being limited to your course material. And I assume something is similar with present day research. You've got all the constraints about what goes into the sample size and what it needs to be completed by and all those things.
That's right. That's right. Go ahead. I was going to say, I think that my immediate conclusion from now wrapping up this project is that the method is very fruitful, and research is never done, right, in a sense. So I see no reason why I can't now formulate like a plan for doing more of this work and talking to people I couldn't find or couldn't include. God willing, like my second approach, I'll maybe be better funded and can right. So that's fine. But yeah.
Oh, that'd be great. I'm sure it's this was regularly. I'm sure they would be very interested in a second edition in a couple of years.
Yes.
I found so fascinating the theme of openness and the idea of a gift running as kind of a running theme throughout your research. Walk us through the idea of couples deciding to be open to children as a gift, and where does that really fit into the story you're telling about why these women choose to have so many children?
Yeah. So there's two parts to that phrase that you just used, openness to a gift. And so I want to maybe focus on the two parts of that. And the first part is openness. And I needed to stress this idea of being open to a child. It's interesting, right? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a research psychologist by a long shot. But one of the positive psychological traits that psychologists have identified is a trait of openness, right? Are you the kind of person that you're open to new experiences, open to the suggestions of people that you're in a relationship with? I heard it said one time like that your marriage was going to be better if you responded positively to just new ideas from your spouse. Like your husband says, let's try this new restaurant, or let's try going someplace new on vacation. That's a character trait called openness, which is really interesting that this other thing happened. So I'm in there trying to figure out like what it means that people want kids, right? So in the background here is this idea that, right, given the givens today, and we didn't really go over this yet, but I'll just say it really briefly. Nobody has to have kids anymore. So first of all, no one has to have kids to be financially successful, right? And that's a different way of putting it, that kids don't have economic value to households anymore, right? Suppose you got up in the morning, you thought, if we don't have like 6 or 7 kids, we aren't going to have enough people to help around the farm or right, whatever. So you don't have to have kids to be financially successful. More to the point, most people think that if you have kids, it's a big financial hit, right, to your household. And then if you don't have to have kids to be married or to be coupled up, you can choose any number of reproductive technologies and not have kids. So it turned out to be really interesting why it is that people want kids and where that comes from today, right? Because now it's like kids are purely a matter of choice. So in that schema, I'm trying to figure out why people want the kids that they have. And you kind of go after it. You go like, hey, did you want 7 kids? Did you always know that you wanted 7 kids? And the answer to that question is going to be a weird answer where they're going to say, well, I didn't want 7. And you're going to like, but you have 7. Does that make you weird? So, but the answer is, for most of the women, I didn't have a number in mind. In other words, this is a kind of choice that doesn't take the form of a standard consumer desire, like where you're like, well, I want another pair of shoes, or I want a pair of shoes. So the openness was more often the kind of, I mean, yeah, there were 1 or 2 women who like, they knew they wanted 12 or whatever. And you're like, oh, that's so funny. How did that happen? But in general, the women I talked to with these above average size families said, well, I didn't go into this wanting a certain size, but I did go into it thinking I wasn't going to close the door. And so what did that leave you? If the door isn't closed, the door is open, right? So it's this language of openness where each child is in principle wanted in advance, but the couple stays open. So they just don't do anything to, they're not permanently going to sterilize themselves. But they might be using some form of family planning before they feel ready for the next child. So openness goes along with a sense of readiness. And then, of course, the sense of readiness for most of the couples I talked to went along with a sense of prayerful discernment. And it was important to walk through this, because what you're basically saying is this is a group of people who, on their own account, has rejected a certain type of, the way I put it, overly planned parenthood, where, you kind of look at your life, you go like, okay, I'm going to have my 2 kids right there. That's what I'm going to do. Right. Oh, but then what it sounds like you're saying, they just didn't plan. They never thought, they didn't plan. It's irrational. But that's not what I heard either. So this is what you see, how it's like being faithful to the narratives. I had to kind of unpack what it means to be open. It definitely involved a certain kind of rational cooperation, a kind of rational planning, but not planning in the way that we mostly tend to think of it today. So I'm trying to paint that picture. And that's where this language of openness comes up. The second part that you asked about openness to a gift, I was really probing for people to tell me, kind of like how they were having kids for the kingdom, or like for God, or for, you could, like, I keep getting these questions these days about people who are having kids to save society, right? Like they think like birth rates are low, let's have kids. And so like you want to know what's going on. Like, are you having kids for some purpose, right? So I asked people to tell me like, what that looks like to be having kids for God. But what I heard almost resoundingly was women tended to resist the language of, they didn't think of themselves as having kids, as kids being something they were doing for God. The language they preferred was that God was doing something for them. And that seemed really significant. So they used the language of gift. So it was more like, well, yeah, I'm open to children. I'm open to discerning God's plan. I'm open to being ready when God makes me feel ready. But what am I being open to? I'm being open to a blessing. that I have to be ready for it, but I'm open to a kind of gift or a blessing. This is why the book is titled Hannah's Children, because who is the most iconic character in the history of the Western tradition who really wants a child and understands herself to be blessed by a child? And you'd have to pick out the biblical Hannah, I think. And that was a very fruitful archetype for me in kind of trying to explain what these women are like. But yeah, so mainly the use of this language of gift, being open to a gift, is to contrast the blessing of children, or the idea of the blessing of children, being blessed by a child, with some other maybe sort of activist view, like I'm having children to do a good thing. I'm having children to give them back to the church or something. I don't know. You could think of a lot of different expressions of this.
Sure. I find that so interesting in part because I did my dissertation on C.S. Lewis's book, Paralandra and That Hidden Strength. And I thought originally that I was writing a Lewis's gender theory paper, but that ended up being part of it. But as I got deeper into the research, what I discovered is that I was really writing a paper about Lewis's theory of reality, and he views all of reality as a gift from the creator to the created, and that the proper response to the gift is it's not one of critique and like double check the gift and look this gift horse in the mouth and make sure it's not filled with soldiers or something. It's actually to receive the gift, to unfold the complexity of the gift, and then to enjoy the gift. And that he kind of taking that joy in the gift is Lewis sees as the right articulation of gratitude. It's not just saying thanks God for making a great world. It's going out and body surfing and enjoying a meadow and appreciating a sunset. All of that is the right orientation towards the gift. And I saw something that's very similar in a lot of the responses that I received, and that there's just this continual openness to the goodness of a child. There was one description of one mom described just all the different personalities that made up her family, and how she had no idea that all these personalities would be added to her life. But now that they were, she wouldn't send any of them back. She wouldn't trade any of them, and she was ready for the next one. And I just thought that was such a beautiful articulation of gratitude.
Yeah, it is. And running with the theme that you've brought forward, this like C.S. Lewis theme. You remind me of one of the ladies she comes up closer to the end of the book. She actually explicitly, your point, right? You don't evaluate or judge the gift. You don't send it back if it's not perfect, right? And she kind of points out how learning that attitude in relation to her children helped her to see humanity in general as more of a gift. So she explicitly says, well, the way ever since I've had my first baby, she says, I started to realize that when I look at people out there who are not related to me, I see a handicapped person. I see somebody who has Down syndrome. She says, I realize that they could be my baby. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she says, well, that's somebody's baby. And she says, well, the truth is, if you live this kind of sense of openness to the gift, when you have a baby that has an imperfection of some kind, you just love that baby. And she said that when she sees other people in society who look disabled or deformed or in any way like imperfect, she sees them as more lovable than she might have before, because she extrapolates from, well, I love my baby, who's the gift from God, who's so lovable with all whatever. And I thought that to me really kind of blew my mind a little bit, was this very concrete connection between experience of gratitude that you just described, which you learn because of your specific gift, but then it's a virtue that you then take to the experience of the world and reality at large, right?
Well, you made a similar argument towards the end of the book that there are lots of virtues that are really necessary for a functioning political society that are really learned in all families. But if I understood this correctly, you thought that they were more clearly gained in larger families just by virtue of the size, the need for older children, younger children, and so on. Could you say a bit more about the kind of some of the unexpected discoveries that you found along the way? What are some of the other benefits that large families create, I guess,
Yeah.
in structures?
Right. So I struggled with the language here, and the language I'm most happy with is that the moms described raising children in a large family as having advantages. So, advantages in terms of bringing up children and certain virtues. So, I say advantages just to emphasize that it's not impossible to raise children in smaller families who still have those kinds of pro-social virtues. But the moms just kind of raved on and on about how, well, look at if I just have 3 bedrooms in my house and I've got 6 kids, I'm stuffing 3 kids in each bedroom. And that's become pretty abnormal to do. But if I do that, well, now I've got 3 kids who've just by virtue of sharing a room with 2 other kids have got to learn how to tolerate other people's personal habits or their foibles or pick up after each other. So they just started talking on and on about how um, like you don't have to work at it. You just stuff them all in a room. And then all of a sudden they have this like tendency to appreciate how to live with other people. And that was one example. They talked about learning to, around the dinner table, there's, maybe there's not, I don't know, I can think of a lot of things I make where I make 10 because that's what the recipe calls for, but there's like the kids would like to have 12, right? And the last couple, they're like, can I have a second? Can I have a third? And you're going, no, you actually kind of have to, just going to have to hold back, just cut those last ones in half. So these things just happen every day. So this is what I mean by an advantage. It's not like you couldn't learn this another way, but just by the run of the mill habits of daily life, the kids are learning to share. They're learning to put others first. They're learning to sort of think about the needs of vulnerable people. Okay, who's vulnerable around me? Well, maybe the 2-year-old who can't go to the bathroom yet is pretty vulnerable. So this is really interesting because we are in this present debate about the way in which the free society does not create the virtues that it depends upon, right? And so this whole question of like, well, okay, the free society can't do it for us. And, so we're in this debate. It's a really interesting debate. And some people are going to say, well, look, so the free society should be, we should back off of the free society, have a little less freedom because actually the free society doesn't create virtue. Others are going to say, well, that's not the whole story here. There's some other political arrangement. What I heard was like a different thesis altogether, something that has not been part of the debate until now, I think, which is kind of like, well, to what extent did our kind of full scale embrace of smaller planned families inadvertently lead us to a situation in which we're undermining these kind of pro-social virtues? Yeah, I don't know. It's not in the debate until now, but I'd like to get it in there, right? So the way I've put it is that the women I talked to, they didn't blame political theory as much as they blamed the way we grow up.
But that does seem to align with my loose sense of recent American history because I don't know. I can't point to a specific moment and say, oh, it was in 1992 that suddenly we started being more selfish.
Right.
But I do have a sense of like, certainly from, I think it's a pretty widely recognized phenomenon that folks are kind of skeptical. If for some reason World War III started tomorrow, Lord knows there's enough ways that could happen right now. If our government issued a call and said, hey, we need 20 million young men age 18 to 40 to enlist tomorrow, I'm pretty skeptical that would be answered positively. In a way that, in contrast, like World War II happened, like boom, like folks are signing up left and right, and I wonder if that kind of systemic change in the family speaks to that somehow. So I think you're onto something very interesting, and it's certainly worth pursuing.
Yeah, it's not something I can obviously fully unpack here, but it jumped off the page. So those last couple of chapters are kind of the things that just jumped out at me that I wasn't after them. I wasn't looking for some new thesis about what's wrong with the American society. But there it was, and I thought, like, I can't not report this. This is pretty big and interesting. So yeah, I think, it doesn't necessarily falsify all other theories, but it's another one that needs to be in the mix, I think. I kind of agree with you about the timeline. I mean, this is it kind of matches the timeline a little bit, but I hope we talk about it more. I'm putting it in the bucket of things that are, like I said, it was gives people advantages, but another way to think about it is like unintended consequences, right? Like we say that virtue has unintended consequences, actually, and in general, vice has unintended negative consequences, and virtues have unintended positive consequences. And so that's kind of the way to dig into it a little bit, right? So and what do I mean by that, unintended? Well, I don't think, nobody I talk to anyway, you get married and you go like, I'd really like to have 6 kids so that I can have an advantage raising unselfish people. Like that would be a really, I think, kind of defective reason to have kids. You want to have children because maybe you think they're a blessing from God, or you think that they are the source of joy, or they are a reflection of your marital love. Like those are very profound and frequently cited motives to have children. Then there's this unintended consequence, which is, oh, but then along the way, accepting these like 6 blessings, I also had an easier time raising my children to be the kind of children I'd like to raise. Or as some people talked about, our marriage seem to benefit from it in different ways. So so that's the category. The bucket I would put these in is like the unintended consequences of a certain kind of virtue, the virtue of being open to receive children as blessings, looks like it leads to these unintended benefits.
Dr. Pakaluk, you're setting all kinds of optimistic curmudgeon records today. I think usually my guests want to talk about the unintended consequences of some federal policy.
Right.
I think you're the first guest I've had who has positive unintended consequences to discuss.
Great.
I want to back up to a question that skipped, because in part, I think it's behind a lot of what you're describing. My sense, I base this off of 6 years of working with high schoolers and now 1 year of working with college students. And my sense is that young ladies in particular really do think that, and I think this much is true of men as well, everybody's convinced that children are expensive. And that particularly that, and so I was very intrigued at your argument about the cost and where the cost is located and kind of how that works with a large family. So could you walk us through sort of what you found or what you're reasoning about where the cost is, particularly for the mother in having a large family?
Yeah. So for sure, you're not an economist, I guess, if you're not interested in costs, but so something that all economists talk about, maybe Austrians a little bit more, but really like all economists talk about is a language of opportunity cost. And I'll shift the focus. So we know what an opportunity cost is. Like, if I'm drinking this, fizzy kombucha, I'm not drinking a latte at the same time, right? So the opportunity cost of drinking this kombucha is not drinking a coffee. So it's like this missed out. Like how much do I care that I've missed out? We like to say that when I've picked the fizzy, what is this, fermented tea? When I picked the kombucha, I've essentially made a value judgment. I've decided I rank this above the coffee. So that's a pure type of opportunity cost. So the first cost is the one that's obvious. Like I paid whatever, probably too much for this thing. It's like $3 or whatever it is. And then the second cost is what else I couldn't have at the same time, right? Then there's a third kind of cost. And the third kind of cost maybe has to do with things that now it won't really make a lot of sense for a consumer good like a coffee or a kombucha tea. But the third kind of cost for something that's consumed over the long run has to do with kind of like the cost to my identity. Like, do I become a kombucha drinker, right? And so like there's this kind of like weird new agey symbol on the front of this bottle. I probably shouldn't put this here because I'm like advertising for them, but we'll just cover that. There's just a weird new agey symbol.
All the money, that'll be fine.
Yeah, and so the point,
sponsor our show. It'll be great.
That's good. We're big drinkers of but the point is like, so if I did this every day, this choice for the thing also has a cost in terms of associating myself or affiliating myself with this type of drink. And that might carry other costs with it related to what kind of group I'm now with or how I think about myself. All right. So you asked about kids. All right. Well, there's the cost of paying for them. That's the first cost. And those are costs that we can identify, like, okay, how much does it cost to have a baby in the hospital or with the midwife? How much is it going to cost to send them to school? How much is it going to cost to feed them, clothe them, et cetera? That's one group of costs. The second cost is the opportunity cost. And that's an enormous spectrum because this isn't something you're going to consume in the next 5 minutes, right? Like this is something that you're not going to be ever done relating to, right? And so what does that mean? It means that, well, the choice to have a child is the choice to um, give up a whole bunch of other things. And those other things are, some of the ones are obvious. Like if I'm, you know, if I'm going to be committed to being with this kid for a certain period of time, there's going to be jobs or other types of things I can't do. Those are kind of obvious, but then there's other things that you just have to scratch your head and realize they're there. Like if I'm going to have this baby, at least for the next 2 years, I'm going to give up like being able to rely on a certain amount of sleep. Right. So that's a cost. Like that's a really serious cost. Or I would think women are pretty familiar with the idea that if you have the next child, you're going to have to face a lot of changes to your body and might be hard to recover from some of those. Some of them you might not ever recover from. So that's a kind of cost. So the choice to have a child means the willingness to put the good of the child in your life. Like you believe that the child is enough good for you to overcome those costs. Or in other words, you rank the good of the child above the other good things that you would have to give up. Cause it's like, let's just be clear. It's a good thing to sleep through the night. It's like really good. Right. So those are two competing goods. So you asked like, what are the costs of having a child? And basically we want to go in that direction. So there's a kind of a funny set of ideas about what makes a good or a bad economist. These trace back to some of the like key thinkers in the history of economics, people like Frederick Bastiat, and he talks about unintended consequences. He says, well, like it's a good economist who thinks about all of the unintended costs or benefits involved with a particular policy choice or something like that. So it's not sufficient basically to look at the outlays, like what you're going to pay for a child. The costs are actually sort of a lot bigger. And I think people know this intuitively, but they don't know how to put words on it. And ultimately in my book, this is, I should have mentioned the identity cost, which is like this cost of being like a mom person and not like a professional person, which is a big problem in a society that is highly values professional work. So the point here is, okay, people are thinking, well, how can we get people to have more kids? Or aren't there ways to incentivize people having more kids? And the first instinct when we incentivize something is to make it cheaper for people, right? So like we want them to go to college. So we have a federal loan program that makes it cheaper. We subsidize education. And so right now what people are thinking is, well, couldn't we sort of subsidize having children? Couldn't we reduce the cost by giving people a check or a bonus or some other kind of thing? And what that depends upon is the idea that the costs, the important costs to whether people decide to have children or not are the ones that are on the surface, like how much you have to pay, right? But my research kind of uncovers that I think women think a lot about the other costs, like the sleeplessness and the effects on your body and the identity cost to being like a mom and not a lawyer anymore, and all of those sorts of things. That's part of the package. And it's very unclear how policy could reduce those costs in any meaningful way. And that's why I kind of dig into that.
Yeah, if I understand your conclusion, and I don't mean to give away too much of the book, but I hopefully our conversation just motivates people to go out and buy it. But if I understand your conclusion, like part of and this ties back to our qualitative versus quantitative methods conversation. What you found is that the women who really are making these conscientious choice, or even if it's just a choice to be open to another child past number 5 to be in your sample size,
right?
They're not doing it because of a superficial cost. They're doing it because they've made a value choice that the openness to this gift is of greater value, primarily because they see that as a gift coming from God. that is directly tied to their personhood, their identity, and the joy that they find in each child. And so, if that's true, then this is not something that is a policy fix. This instead is a question of what is of ultimate value? Are people of ultimate value? And if so, that changes the calculus a lot more than, well, we're going to get a tax break if we have a kid.
Yeah, that's a totally fair and accurate summary. In terms of the qualitative versus the quantitative, I saw myself as not trying to tell people it won't work to incentivize having children, but to helping to explain why it hasn't worked. Because lots of countries have tried all kinds of different ways to do this. So that's, of course, that's the reason to do theory work. You're like, well, why, so talk to people having children. But in terms of what countries can do, I find a useful analogy for thinking about policy, and this is not in the book, so it might be worth just saying it out loud, is first of all, think about what kind of an action this is that you'd like to incentivize. It's an action, after all, that we'd like to incentivize. It's not like a spot transaction in the sense of, sure, you can incentivize like buying less cigarettes. We know we can do that. The action we want to incentivize people to do is like take on this like infinite human relationship for not just for 18 years, but for, God willing, most of your lifetime. So I like to think of it like this. It's like running a marathon is something that's really, really hard to do. It's going to be really costly. And there are going to be direct costs associated with running a marathon for sure. You got to train, you got to buy certain shoes and sneakers, and maybe you need gear. And we could reduce those costs. But the biggest costs of running a marathon are just like the grinding, like commitment of being out there running for hours and hours and hours, like for weeks and weeks on end, right? That's all personal. That's all like personal opportunity cost. It's like pain and suffering and, transformation of your identity and your body and your time and your schedule. So the real question when we look at whether countries can incentivize people to have children is really on that margin. Like, could you get a lot more people to run marathons if you passed out sneakers? I don't know. Maybe there's a dude out there like ready to go. He just doesn't have any sneakers. There'll be some marginal guy that like all of a sudden he's a runner because he didn't have sneakers. But like when we look around and we see like, how come not that many people run marathons? The right answer is because it's hard. And like you have to have a really good reason to do this thing to overcome all of that personal difficulty, right? So I do think thoughtfully we could ask the question, what gives people the drive to do that hard thing? And I would suspect that most people who do end up running a marathon do so because they were inspired by somebody else. Like they saw a fitness guy and they were like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. So you have to get people to do this thing through some kind of positive motivation. And that comes from where? So at least in my research, for most people, it came from some experience with a living religious community. Mm-hmm. Right. And so could governments as a way to at least foster an environment in which people who want to run marathons can encounter, which people who perhaps don't want to run marathons can encounter the reasons to do it. Could they foster living religious communities better? Well, yeah, I'd say, let's have a conversation about how we treat our churches. And, I think having just lived through COVID, we might have to conclude soberly that we don't treat our churches that well. We like view them as like alternative sources of power over people's lives. And we get jealous of that. We don't want our churches to say, hey, we're going to still hold this meeting. We'll have it outside, but we're still going to hold this meeting. Right. And we can keep going. Like, do we make it easy for churches to provide education? Do we make it easy for churches to meet people's needs? Or, for instance, how we crowded out the activity of churches through substituting public charity, where we used to do private charity through churches. And, all of those, I think, would lead us to maybe some hard conversations about how we could make it easier for churches to do what they do. Yeah. So that's a long answer.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think it's a really helpful answer because it moves this out of the realm. I went to a conference a couple of years ago where I had dinner with a guy from Hungary, and he was telling me all kinds of really interesting policy solutions about alleviating income tax burdens and buying big minivans. And this was going to be kind of the way to reverse But at least last I looked, it hasn't moved the needle in any meaningful way. And I think you've identified the fact that we have these ladies at least all attest to a far more transcendent reason for choosing the difficulties of children.
Yeah.
And that puts us in a whole different space that our government is far less capable of participating in. But at the same time, it points right back to some great answers for hope. I mean, that the institutions are still there. It's our churches, it's our families, it's the wider community, and it really, I suspect, involves a civilizational recognition that we have misprioritized the true value of women, and that we need to figure out a way to rightly prioritize them and be able to say that without sounding misogynistic. My turn to like struggle with language.
Yeah, no, I actually think this fits the title of your podcast perfectly. I mean, I have a lot of optimism about this, but also like nestled within this real, I guess, curmudgeonly view that like things are bad. But why am I optimistic? Because I don't think it will respond to policy, at least in the traditional sense, right? But actually, I think churches and living religious communities have a tremendous opportunity to like change the game here. Yeah. So, number one, like that's where the hope is. And that's pretty huge, I think. Just information can move the needle here, right? Sharing these kinds of, I mean, actually, I didn't write the book for this reason, but I've gotten a lot of emails from people who read the book and changed their mind, like thought, you know what, I was done, but I'm going to have another kid. And I thought like, wow, like how cool is that?
Well, there are so many surprising. I want to mention two, and then we probably do need to wrap up here at not too long. But there were so many surprising. I might steal your word too. Advantages that I was just not expecting to read about. One of those was there was a story of a family with an infant that needed to be flipped every so many minutes,
right?
And the mom's solution was that every child would just flip the baby every time you walk past. And they solved that within the family. And there was another one where there was an older child who was just going through a season of depression, but holding the new baby was really healing for that child. And there are just so many of these. You just gave us so many great stories that really attested to the beauty of the family and the way the family does provide healing in a way that if the family's not, and we're looking to wider society and the market to solve that, it's very expensive and not very efficient. It's
not very
far
efficient.
better to have these families that naturally heal these human harms. It seems
Yeah. There's a lot there. It's really deep. It took me a long time to write this, in part because of sitting on these stories and thinking, how do I get this out? How do I organize this? How do I put this together? Because it did seem a lot of it, like the stories you just mentioned, kind of sublime. So how do you put that out in a way that's does justice to the material? So it was a lot of grappling with that. But yeah, I think it's somehow a serious book. It deals with a really serious subject, but I do believe it reads hopeful. It reads that there's reasons to be hopeful.
I certainly think so. Well, Dr. Pakaluk, now that this book is out, and I'm sure I hope you're getting all kinds of publicity and opportunities. But what's next in your writing pipeline now? Is there another book in the works or something different?
Yes. Well, I would like to say, gee, I need a break first, and realistically, I probably have another few months of spreading this one around. But I've been overwhelmingly asked to go and talk to the dads, not the same dads of the exact same families, but do a project where I talk to men who have chosen to have several children with their wives and kind of figure out like what moves them and what drives them. I wouldn't assume that the same archetypes or ideas would be present, and that might be very interesting. So I've been asked to do that. People have affectionately on Twitter X called this the Hannah's Baby Daddies Project. So maybe that's on the horizon. Like there might be something fun about doing that. But separately, some people have asked about maybe a project similarly taking a kind of qualitative look at what allows young people, like in the order of, 5 to 10 years below the national average, to transition into marriage. So we know that a big piece, not the whole piece, but a big piece of this falling birth rate puzzle is people getting married a lot later. But I'm sure probably some of your students at Thales, some of my own grown children have gotten married in their early 20s. My son, who was married last summer, was 19. What drives them? What causes them to think about marriage this way? What immunizes them against this general idea that like marriage is something you do only after you check a bunch of boxes? And again, the thought there would be like, it's really good to know the thought process and what kinds of values are on the table for them. So those are the two that I think are kind of highest on the list. Talking to really young couples about why they chose marriage, and talking to dads.
Well, add me to the list of people who vote for Hannah's Baby Daddy as the new book title. I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know a scholar at University of Notre Dame, Abigail Favale?
I do. I'm a really big fan of her work.
I read her Genesis of Gender probably 2 years ago and just loved it. And
yeah,
I don't know, she came on the show, I think back in season 4.
Okay.
And we talked about her book. And at the end, she explained she got a similar response where a lot of folks were like, okay, this is great. It's mostly about women, and that's great.
Yeah.
Do you have something that's really about a positive vision of masculinity?
Right.
I don't know if you're looking for any other partners, but it seems to me like you and Dr. Favale both have very interesting views that are swirling around very gendered roles. And it would be interesting if y'all ever did anything together. I just think
that's a great suggestion. Cool. I will chew on that and maybe talk to Abigail about it. In fact, I'd like to know if she's working on that book, because that would be great. I do think her work on this is really about the best you can find. I think it's so balanced. It's balanced, and but as you said, it's a positive vision. It's beautiful, and it points the way rather than just rejecting a bunch of things. And I think that's kind of what's needed right now. Like, it's easy to look around and say, there's not enough marriage, there's not enough children, there's not enough, femininity. It's way harder to say what you think that ought to be, right? Right.
Sure.
And I think that's actually like the project of civilization, is actually to sort of figure out what is the content of the good, not just, like you said, just at arm's length, like the free society will solve it or markets will solve it. No, like we have to know what we're heading towards, right? So I agree with you. I'm a big fan of Abigail's work, and I think that's a great suggestion. So,
if y'all ever do something together, let's get both of you back on the show to talk about it.
That'd be fun. Great. Thanks.
Dr. Pakaluk, how can people find and follow your work online?
Well, I'm on, the platform formerly known as Twitter. So I'm on X, and I sometimes share my work there. I have a recently and developing website, catherine.pakaluk.com. And of course, you can typically find some way to contact me at the Catholic University of America, but probably for shorthand, find me on X.
Perfect. Very well. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really fun talking with you.
You're so welcome, Josh. Likewise.
Thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. Catherine Pakaluk of the Catholic University of America. The book is Hannah's Children, the women quietly defying the birth dearth. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.
You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. Thank you to the Acton Institute for sponsoring this episode. Listeners and viewers, if you want to let me know what you thought about the episode, or if you too want to sponsor an episode, please message me on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Just search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.